Hi, my name is Iyer-Raniga and I'm Professor at RMIT University in Melbourne. Welcome to my Study Australia Masterclass. I'm going to be talking to you about sustainability in the built environment. This issue is more urgent now than ever before. We've had international programs and agreements such as COP26 that have discussed about the importance of climate and a future for all of us, particularly the younger generations who are going to be the decision makers of tomorrow. So what is sustainability? Sustainability essentially means protecting our planet. It means that we need to think about not just what is going on in the planet now, but how are we going to keep our planet for next generations of people living on this world, to be able to get resources, to be able to get water, to be able to get food, to be able to have a lifestyle that is very similar to what we have today. And I think it's pertinent to say that COP26 has shown that it is not possible for one part of the world, i.e. the people with money, the developed world, have got access to technology, have got access to materials, have got access to resources, while leaving behind the developing world. It is really important now, more so than ever before, that we ensure that the resources are there not just for the people who can afford to pay for these resources, but also for the people that cannot afford to pay for them. I know there are lots of people there that don't believe in the science of climate change, but I think there's growing evidence, and the recent IPCC reports, the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change reports, have demonstrated quite clearly that such type of activities, be they bushfires, be they floods, be they storm surges, are all going to continue if we don't do something about our climate. So let's take a little bit of a look now as to how this is going to impact on the built environment. During heat waves, it becomes very difficult for people to live in their homes if their homes are not well insulated. If it's very hot outside, and if the homes are also very hot inside, that impacts on the comfort of people, and people can get very sick. So the impact of climate change cannot be just said to be something that might happen in a distant future, but we are seeing the effects of it already happening now. So let's take a look at the built environment itself. Building materials are the essential blocks of buildings. You can't make buildings without materials. You can't make buildings without brick and cement and concrete. These materials are mined somewhere else in the world, usually with our global supply chains. As we've seen in the COVID situation, we have found that certain building materials have been impacted, and it's very difficult to get some of these materials. At the moment in Australia, for instance, it's very difficult to get hold of timber. So these building materials that make our houses, that make our built environment, that make the places where we work, all need to come from somewhere. And in the process of mining these materials, there are emissions. So roughly speaking, the built environment has been said to be taking about 40% of primary energy use. So when you take into consideration the virgin materials that are extracted, which then become the raw materials to make up the built environment, that's about 40%. In the process of production of all these different raw materials, there are emissions. The types of energy that is being used, and often it's fossil fuel-based energy that is used for making these building materials. So that also has an impact on the climate and our global temperatures, therefore. Then we have to also take into consideration how these materials are transported. So if, for instance, mining is done, say, in Central America, and those materials are made, say, in China, then it needs to be transported from Central America to China, and then from China to Australia. So in the process of these transmission, also there's energy that needs to be taken into consideration. So all the energy that is used to make buildings is called embodied energy. And then you've got to think about, once these buildings are built, then these buildings need to be heated and cooled. So the energy that is used to heat and cool buildings is called operational energy. Typically, buildings may last for 50, 80, or 100 years. And normally, if you look at the standard ratio between embodied energy and operational energy, it's about 20% of embodied energy and 80% of operational energy. What we also need to take into consideration is that the embodied energy ratio between the embodied energy and the operational energy is actually now beginning to increase. So we are at a point now where, as we've become more and more we've become better with reducing the amount of energy that is used for operations of a building, the ratio between the embodied and the operational energy is no longer the 20% of embodied and 80% of operational. So we've actually got to consider not just the operational energy, we also need to start thinking about the embodied energy. So we need to start thinking about the sorts of materials that need to go into our building, the sorts of materials that are going to be specified in the construction of these buildings, and perhaps also the type of technology that goes into the construction of these type of buildings. So if you look at examples of great buildings that are trending towards net zero, which is something that came up in COP26, then we need to take into consideration buildings that are using materials that have already been used elsewhere, either in that building. So if it's, for instance, a renovation of a building, then parts of that building could be dismantled and reused again. So for instance, the bricks or the timber or the doors and windows of that particular building. We can also start thinking about how buildings, if they're being demolished, or to use a better word, deconstructed, so those materials could be used over and over again, then we're looking into what is called as the circular economy. So circular economy is where we're beginning to look at how materials could be reused into buildings, and materials could therefore become or come to a point where we're not having to mine virgin materials to make our building blocks now, but we can actually use the existing built environment in the form of urban mining to be able to use these materials over and over again. So before talking about the circular economy, I'd like to go back to COP and to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals came into effect on the 1st of January 2016, and the time frame is from 2016 to 2030. So the Sustainable Development Goals have got 17 goals, and they've got a number of different targets and a number of different indicators to be able to achieve these targets. So the first of these Sustainable Development Goals is no poverty. And as you can tell, by placing no poverty as the first Sustainable Development Goal, we are focusing on those parts of the world where people have been mired in poverty for a long period of time, whether that might be as a result of political issues, whether that's a result of climate change and not having enough food and water to drink. The second one is zero hunger, very closely linked with poverty, but also taking into consideration about farming practices and modern ways of moving away perhaps from a society that's very intent on being a meat-based society into one that is more of a vegetarian-based society. The eco-footprint of meat production is much higher compared to the eco-footprint of vegetable production. The third Sustainable Development Goal focuses on good health and well-being. Now, this is really important in the context of the built environment because we live in places that needs to be comfortable. The example that I gave earlier about people being stressed as a result of a very hot day outside, if they don't have a comfortable environment inside, they're going to have all sorts of physiological reactions. So it's really important to ensure that thermal comfort is a very important part of good health and well-being. The fourth Sustainable Development Goal is about quality education. And we're learning things all the time. Just don't assume that somebody who's been tertiary educated knows everything there is to know about that particular discipline. We are learning things about the impact that the climate is having on the planet. We are learning things about how we can inculcate sustainable development goals across all areas of education. So it's a learning journey that we're all a part of, and this is an important aspect for us to take into consideration. The fifth Sustainable Development Goal is about gender equality. And again, recent events in Australia have highlighted the role of women and the role of women in leadership positions. The sixth one is about water. As I've said, that materials are a building block for the built environment and for buildings. In the same way, we cannot build buildings without water. Water is often used in the process of extraction and mining. Water is also used in the production and manufacture of building materials. And of course, when we use buildings, be they houses or be they places where we work, we need to use water. Sustainable Development Goal 7 is about energy. Energy, as I've said before, with the case of building materials, we need energy to make them. We need energy to mine materials. We need to start thinking more and more now about how might we use renewable energy within our buildings. Now, this may be in the form of photovoltaic panels on the roof of a building, or we might actually have windows that are integrated with photovoltaic panels to become what is called as building integrated photovoltaic panels. And there are buildings around the world that are beginning to do this. The next Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 8, is about decent work and economic growth. And here's an important fact to take into consideration. The process of building and construction is often a litmus test of how economies are performing. If economies are doing really well, that means building and construction activity is also going really well. One of the first industries that are affected as a result of a recession or a down cycle is the building and construction industry. So in other words, the building and construction industry actually provides jobs. In Australia, about 9% of our GDP is associated with buildings and construction. And globally, it's about 10%. But what we're still trying to understand is in the developing part of the world, the building and construction activity is dominated by informal sector. And therefore, rather than 10%, it might be more like 20 or 30% of the workforce that's associated with building and construction activity, and therefore the GDP. Sustainable Development Goal 9 is about infrastructure. Now, this is again very closely related to building activity. In the example that I gave you earlier about Australian cities, these cities need infrastructure in order to be able to function on a day-to-day basis. So we need our trains, we need our roads, we need our rail. And this is an area that is of special focus in the developing part of the world because that's where building and construction activity is taking place at a very rapid growth. Sustainable Development Goal 10 is about reduced inequalities. If there are parts of the world that don't have access to water or don't have access to food, and other parts of the world that have got more than what they require, there needs to be some level of equity in the distribution of this. Sustainable Development Goal 11 is also very closely related to the built environment. This is about sustainable cities and communities. When we think about the future population of Australia and we start thinking about the way the cities are currently, we also need to start thinking about how might we look at Sustainable Development Goal 11 in a sustainable manner and ensure, for instance, moving away from single housing into more of apartment type of housing, so medium density or even high densities, so that the infrastructure that is currently existing can serve more people over a period of time. Sustainable Development Goal 12 is about our production and consumption practices. Think about a house that's 80 square meters and another house that's 160 square meters. The 80 square meter house might use a certain amount of energy to heat or cool the house. Think about the 160 square meter house. The chances are to cool or heat this house, you're going to need double the energy that you've used on the 80 square meter house. But think about it also from the perspective of the things that we have within the space. Think about the carpets, think about the furniture, think about the appliances that we use. All of these have got a footprint of energy and water use somewhere in the world. So really, what SDG 12 is about is very closely linked to the principles of circular economy. It's about us trying to make the best with what we have got without us trying to mine more and more materials. So in the example of a house, let's see if we can try and use some of those bricks, some of those carpets, some of those doors and window frames into the new house. But we can also extend that to things that we do on a daily basis. Think about the clothes that we buy, the food that we eat. All of this is important for when we start thinking about all the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 13 is about climate action. And this again is so important for us to take into consideration. When we look back, particularly when we look back to 1972 and think about the oil crisis and all the things that have happened since then, a lot of our focus has been on energy issues. And even now, a lot of our focus is about what is called as mitigation. So where we are trying to reduce the amount of emissions that we have into the atmosphere. But we also need to start thinking about adaptation and resilience. We need to start thinking about how can we ensure that the buildings that are built today are also going to be able to withstand unprecedented floods or storm surges or whatever else the climate might throw at us. Because if we don't, then what we're going to get into is a cycle of us constantly having to build and rebuild. And that process of rebuilding, in turn, is going to have an impact on the amount of materials that we use, and the emissions that we have, and the amount of energy we use, and the amount of water that we use, and so on. We need to ensure that these cities are built such that they're not only thinking about a net zero from a mitigation perspective, but are also able to withstand the effects of climate change into the near future. SDG 14 is about life below water. Now, it may not directly impact on the built environment. It does look at how people use the built environment. So the use of plastics and the use of a number of things that we do on a daily basis in the built environment, particularly in the form of takeaway containers, is something that often ends up through our stormwater systems into the ocean. And there are some very powerful images that have been shown to demonstrate the amount of plastic waste that's ending up in the oceans and destroying marine life in the oceans itself. But also from a built environment perspective, we need to start thinking about how some of these materials are used on a construction site. So for instance, there are lots of things that are wrapped in plastic that doesn't have to be wrapped in plastic. So that's something that some of the top-notch builders and building professionals are now thinking about as to how the design and the packaging of some of these materials can be done in a form where plastic is not necessarily the only element that is being used, and whether the need to have plastic is there at all. SDG 15 is about life on land and very closely linked to the built environment. When we think about the process of building and construction, think about the land. Think about where that land comes from, or think about what used to be on that land before a building was built. And I love to use this example of the Aboriginals or the First Nations people here in Australia. They didn't build anything. They used the land around them, and they moved depending on the seasons so that the land around them could regenerate. So while we can't think about moving the way the Aboriginals did, we can certainly start thinking about building from the perspective of being more sensitive to the use of the building itself and the land from where it comes from. There's also a health-related benefit to this. the more we are surrounded by forests and greenery, the better it is for our psychological health. So buildings that are in tune with nature and buildings that are built in order to think about the people that are living in these buildings rather than the building itself, I think is something that needs to be brought back into the discussion and the debate. Sustainable Development Goal 16 is about peace, justice, and institutions that support this. So let's think about examples in the built environment. Let's think about building where we're not just thinking about social housing, but that is interspersed with private housing or housing that appeals to the medium and the higher income earners in the marketplace. So these are some of the things that could be done from a built environment perspective to start thinking about building equities rather than having these pockets of really expensive or very rich suburbs versus those that are dedicated for the social housing type of suburbs. The final SDG is about partnerships, SDG 17. And perhaps the most important, because none of the SDGs from 1 to 16 can actually happen because SDG 17 brings it all together. And it is really impossible to focus on any one particular SDG without thinking about how these SDGs interact with each other. So that we're thinking about not just the built environment or not just thinking about infrastructure, but we're also thinking about people, we're thinking about food, we're thinking about mobility, we're thinking about the goods that we need on a day-to-day basis for us to be able to survive. And what is really interesting for me, having worked in this space for quite some time now, is that 5 and 6 years on since the start of the Sustainable Development Goals, we're actually beginning to see some action across the built environment industry. We're beginning to see policy changes, not just here in Australia, but across the world, taking into consideration the different Sustainable Development Goals. And we are beginning to see this now being enacted into what are called as the National Determined Contribution. And each of these countries have determined which national contributions they want to focus on. And Australia has, for instance, looked at housing as one of the key areas, and particularly social housing as one of the key areas that it wants to work on as part of its national determined contributions. Circular economy is becoming a bit of a buzzword like sustainability used to be. I think part of this is because of international discussions and debates, for instance, the World Circular Economy Forum, but also a growing understanding of what circular economy actually means. Now, you might wonder, what is the difference between sustainability and circular economy? Well, essentially, they're the same. The principles upon which circular economy is based is no different from the triple bottom line of the environmental, economic, and social underpinnings of sustainability. I think the biggest difference, though, is that circular economy has a use of the word economy in it. And because sustainability has not really achieved what it set out to do since 1972, circular economy has appealed to the economic rationalists and the market capitalists. And this drive to be able to still pursue profits rather than taking the deep ecology approach of sustainability has made a difference. So we now see that a number of governments in Australia, particularly the state governments across the eastern seaboard, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, and even Western Australia and Tasmania have now jumped on the bandwagon of circular economy, and circular economy policies and programs have been set up across all these different states and territories. The value of circular economy to Australia was estimated to be $26 billion. So the business proposition, if we move to a circular economy, is quite simple. You can continue to still produce and do the things that businesses normally do, But in the process of doing so, they can also continue to make money and they can grow their businesses. So here's another reason. For every 10,000 tons of waste that goes into the landfill, at the moment, there's about 2.8 jobs. However, if those 10,000 tons were diverted from the landfill towards a circular economy, you're actually creating 9.2 equivalent full-time jobs. So here is another reason why governments across Australia are interested in the possibility of a circular economy. From a buildings and construction perspective, is a very important aspect when we think about climate change, think about mitigation, think about sustainability, and now when we think about circular economy. And it has been estimated that if we continued to work in the way we are doing now, then just cement alone is responsible for about 12% of emissions into the future by 2050 and 2060. So what this signals for a country like Australia is that if we get this equation right, the country is expected to continue to grow to 40 million people in the near future. And so if we start thinking about buildings and construction from the perspective of a circular economy, then we can also start thinking about how some of the material that is already being used currently could be diverted rather than into the landfill, can be brought back onto the buildings and construction site. So yes, it does require us to start thinking about zero waste, but it also gets us to start thinking a little bit more creatively about some of the types of materials that might be used as our building blocks. So do we need to continue to use cement and concrete and bricks? Or can we start thinking about buildings that could be used or made from other materials? Recently in Africa, a company collected plastic bottles that were thrown away by people, compacted these plastic bottles, these are drinking bottles, compacted them with earth and used them as infill materials within their homes. Now, not only this created an opportunity to use a different type of infill or wall construction, but it also created job opportunities for the women and for the unemployed. So simple solutions such as that can actually make a big difference in the built environment. Let's think about some of the other examples. For instance, normally when buildings are built, the lighting, the heating, or panels, photovoltaic panels on the roof, is all done by the building owner or the building manager. Now, this building where I'm speaking from today has got some really good examples of some of those sustainability principles that have been used in the building. But just imagine if rather than us having to make the building owner responsible for all the lighting in the building, but if that was done as a service that was provided by somebody else, that brings in a new type of business into the marketplace. So now we are moving from a product owned into a service type of business where lighting, as an example, could be a service that is provided by somebody else. So that's a new type of business opportunity, but it also allows the building owner the opportunity to focus on other things in the building. So lighting could be panned off to somebody else to look after, including bringing in new technologies into the lighting system, including bringing in new ways of keeping up to date, of future-proofing some of these technologies into the near future. A good example of this again is in Amsterdam Airport and Schiphol Airport, where Philips has taken over the responsibility of lighting the whole airport. So it's not something that normally an asset owner like the airport would have done themselves. So this sort of type of business models where we're moving from something that is owned by the building into something that is being serviced by somebody else creates new business opportunities. This could also be done for things like carpets and for other parts or other items of a building, including furniture that could have a good turnover period, but that is being managed by somebody else entirely, which gives those businesses, but also the building owners, an opportunity to test the market in terms of bringing in more guaranteed materials and long life materials, new types of materials, turnaround type of materials into what would have otherwise been a very difficult job by the owner itself. I'd like to give you an example of circularity that touches across all parts of a building. And at least in my mind, this is the best practice example of what circularity and sustainability should be like. So imagine a building that is completely net zero. It captures its own energy and therefore uses this energy, which could be in the form of a photovoltaic panel on a roof. Imagine that it captures its own water. So the water that runs off from its roof is captured within the building itself. The building also grows some food, and this food is seasonal. The building has been built as a net zero, so it's highly efficient in terms of the way the building is designed. So it captures the sun in wintertime, so it uses less energy to heat the building. And in summertime, because of the high summer sun, the building is well shaded, so it uses less energy to cool the building. It also has enough ventilation in it, so there's an opportunity for cross ventilation when the weather is right, or the building has the opportunity to purge the heat that's stored during the day out at night time, so the building cools at night time. But also imagine that this building, in the process of growing its own food, also teaches people how to cook that food, or uses it as an opportunity to teach the youth and the unemployed as a vocation. So food preparation, food handling could become a vocation. So a building need not just be the bare bones. It doesn't have to be just this physical space, but this building can also become a hive of activity where it cuts across all the different SDGs that I've already mentioned. So not only is it thinking about SDG 6 in relation to water, or SDG 7 in relation to energy, but it's also thinking about SDG 8 in terms of providing an opportunity for economic growth. It also hits SDG 4 in terms of education. It also hits SDG 3 in terms of being a really vibrant and healthy inner space or indoor environmental quality that is supportive of a comfortable environment for people to live and work in. When all this is done together in partnership, say with councils or with various types of non-governmental organizations or with educational institutions or with specific type of businesses, then we are looking at a building that can become a catalyst as an instrument that can put all the 17 SDGs into action. Because as I said before, in the 21st century, it's going to be very difficult for us to live like the First Nations of this land did, but we can certainly start thinking about how might we bring in some of that knowledge, some of that thinking into what we do on a daily basis. So how much can we learn from some of our Indigenous or our First Nations people? And this can be also in terms of the food that is grown, the seasonal food that's grown, but we can also expand that into other parts of the world, into some of the construction practices, into some of the local materials that might be used, and therefore can become a part of the procurement practices of circularity and sustainability. Here in Australia, we are not that far away. We have got, yes, at a state level, we've got different circular economy policies and programs across the different states. And no two states are exactly at the same point. But we're turning things around here as well. For instance, in Victoria, in 2019, there was an issues paper on circular economy. And in 2020, the new plan of action came into effect. We've also got the Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre here, which is managed by Sustainability Victoria. We've also got now a new authority called Recycling Victoria that is going to work across both the legislation side of waste and circular economy, but also going to be assisting governments, businesses and industry and communities to assist them in their own journey towards circularity. Now that's a future that I'm looking forward to being a part of. I'm Usha Iyer-Raniga, Professor at RMIT University based here in Melbourne, and you've been listening to my Study Australia Masterclass.